Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest details in ancient history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 323 before Christ, in the city of Babylon, Alexander the Great died. And almost immediately, the most powerful empire in the world developed a problem. Not a small one, a very dead one, because Alexander had spent years conquering vast territories, defeating the Persian Empire, marching to India, and generally collecting land like it was a hobby he took way too seriously. But he had not done one very important thing. He had not left a clear successor, which meant that within hours of his death, the room was filled with powerful men trying very hard to look calm while mentally drawing battle plans against each other. His generals, later called the Diadochi, gathered around him and asked the obvious question, who gets the empire? Alexander, according to tradition, replied, to the strongest, which is not a plan. That is the ancient equivalent of saying, you guys figure it out, and then leaving the group chat permanently. But before they could start fighting, which they absolutely would, enthusiastically and with swords, there was a more immediate issue sitting right in front of them, Alexander's body. Because in the ancient world, a king's corpse was not just a corpse, it was a political asset, a symbol, a very expensive piece of influence that, unfortunately, could not be locked in a safe. Whoever controlled Alexander in death could claim a connection to him in life, and that connection could be turned into legitimacy, and legitimacy could be turned into armies. So now, instead of one problem, they had two. No clear ruler, and one extremely important body that everyone suddenly cared about way more than they probably expected. Burying him immediately would have solved the physical problem, but it would have created a political one. Because once he was buried, he was fixed in one place, and whoever controlled that place would instantly gain a massive advantage, which meant nobody wanted to rush that decision. So the generals hesitated. They needed time to argue, time to scheme, time to pretend they weren't about to betray each other. And unfortunately, time is not something a dead body handles particularly well. This is where things become practical. They needed a way to keep Alexander intact, recognizable, presentable, preferably not alarming, because transporting the most famous man in the world is already complicated. Transporting him while he is actively decomposing is even worse. So the question became very simple. How do you preserve the most important corpse in the world long enough to decide what to do with it? And somewhere in that discussion, someone had an idea. A strange one, a slightly unsettling one, but also a very effective one. Honey. Because when your empire is falling apart, you start with preservation, literally. Now that the generals had accepted one uncomfortable reality, that they needed to keep Alexander, well, intact, a second problem became impossible to ignore. Where was he actually going? Because Alexander wasn't just going to be buried anywhere. There were expectations. Tradition said he should be buried in Macedon, the homeland he had left years earlier, the land of his ancestors, the place where kings of his dynasty were laid to rest. Very respectable, very appropriate, also extremely far away. Babylon to Macedon is not a short journey. It's not even a medium journey. It's thousands of kilometers across rivers, mountains, deserts, and regions that were currently trying to decide whether they were still part of the empire, which is not ideal travel conditions, even for someone alive. And Alexander at this point was contributing very little to the logistics. This meant one thing. The funeral procession was going to take months, not days, not weeks, months. And during that time, the body had to survive the journey. Because arriving with a well-preserved king sends a very different message than arriving with a situation. And remember, this wasn't just a funeral, it was a political event, a moving symbol of power. Every city the procession passed through would see it, every soldier would hear about it, every rival would be watching closely, which meant the body needed to look like Alexander, recognizable, dignified, preferably not melting under the Babylonian sun. So now the generals were dealing with a very specific challenge. They needed to transport the most famous man in the world across an unstable empire in the middle of a power struggle while keeping him visually acceptable the entire time. No pressure. This is where the idea of preservation became less theoretical and more urgent, because without it, the journey simply wasn't possible. Time was no longer just a political advantage, it was a biological problem. The longer they waited, the worse things would get. And since rushing wasn't an option, they needed something that could slow everything down, something reliable, something available, and something that did not require modern technology, because they did not have that. Which is when someone looked at a very ordinary substance and had a very unusual thought: honey. Because if you can't shorten the journey, you extend the condition of the traveler, even if the traveler is no longer particularly involved in the decision. At first glance, preserving one of history's greatest conquerors in honey sounds like someone suggested as a joke and then nobody stopped them. But here's the surprising part: it actually made sense. A lot of sense, because honey is not just food, it is one of the most effective natural preservatives available. Something ancient people understood long before modern chemistry came along to explain it. Honey has very low moisture content, which means bacteria struggle to survive in it. It is also naturally acidic, creating an environment where the microbes responsible for decay simply do not thrive. In simple terms, honey is extremely bad for anything trying to decompose, which is exactly what you want when dealing with a body that needs to remain presentable for months. Ancient civilizations had already figured this out. Honey had been used to preserve fruits, meats, and even small animals. In some cases, it could keep organic material intact for surprisingly long periods of time. So, when the generals needed a solution, honey wasn't as random as it sounds. It was practical, accessible, and most importantly, effective. Now, to be clear, this was likely not the only method used. Alexander's body was probably treated with additional preservation techniques, possibly involving oils, herbs, or early forms of embalming, influenced by Egyptian practices. Because if you're preserving the most important person in the world, you don't rely on just one idea. You combine ideas. You overdo it slightly. You make absolutely sure nothing goes wrong. But honey would have played a key role. It would have slowed decay, reduced odor, and helped maintain the body's appearance long enough for transport. Which brings us to the slightly strange image that history leaves us with. Somewhere in Babylon, preparations are underway. A massive empire is on the verge of civil war. Powerful generals are quietly planning their next moves. And in the middle of all this, Alexander the Great is being placed into a container filled with honey. Not as a symbol, not as a ritual, but as a solution. Because sometimes the most important decisions in history are not dramatic, they're practical, and occasionally a little sticky. Now, here's the slightly frustrating part. We do not have a detailed ancient manual titled "How to Preserve the Greatest Conqueror in Honey Without Making It Awkward." History unfortunately skipped that document. What we do have are scattered references from ancient writers suggesting that Alexander's body was treated and preserved, likely using a combination of techniques, one of which involved honey. So we're left to reconstruct the process using logic, context, and a bit of educated guesswork, which is always fun. First, the body would have been cleaned. This wasn't just about respect, it was about slowing decay. Removing fluids, washing the body, and preparing it for preservation would have been essential. Next, oils and possibly herbs were applied. Ancient cultures used aromatic oils not just for ritual purposes, but because they helped reduce odor and slow the breakdown of tissue. Think of it as early-stage preservation with a strong emphasis on "please don't let this go wrong." Then comes the honey. The body was likely placed in a container, possibly a sarcophagus or sealed vessel, and submerged or surrounded with honey. Not gently drizzled, not artistically arranged, fully immersed, which is a sentence nobody expected to hear about Alexander the Great. The goal was simple: seal the body in an environment where decay could not progress easily. And honey did exactly that. It reduced exposure to air, limited bacterial growth, and essentially created a protective barrier around the body. Was it perfect? No. Was it effective enough for a long journey? Yes, and that's all they needed. Because remember, this was not about preserving Alexander forever. It was about buying time. Time to transport him, time to decide where he would be buried, time for his generals to figure out who was about to start a war with whom.